Welcome to Marketecture, where you can get smart fast with in-depth interviews of technology leaders. I'm Ari Paparo, and I'm here with Ray Kingman, the CEO and founder of Semcasting. Thanks for being here, Ray.
Thanks, Ari. I appreciate the time.
So, what is Semcasting?
Semcasting is a data and identity service provider, and we're focused on what we call high regulatory markets, which is a slightly different positioning, I believe, than most of the identity services out there. We've really honed in from the beginning on the regulatory markets of healthcare, financial services, politics, and certain areas of B2B.
Right. Does that include geographic? So is it more of a Europe focus or is it?
No, it's strictly U.S. and Canada right now.
Okay, got it. Okay, well, we'll go into a lot more depth on that. Tell me about the company first. How long ago was it founded and how big is it?
Sure. I mean, Semcasting's been around since 2009.
Oh, wow.
We started as an offline data provider. We created, basically the company was the product of a predictive modeling platform based on genetic algorithms, where we built predictive variables for home values and incomes and discretionary income and net worth, and mostly focused on financial services. And that platform, I got to a point where it was time to sort of, if you can call it, eat your own dog food, which was the idea of moving that data variable into the marketplace as a marketing asset. And so we began to build a compiled file of the United States. And then we're pretty successful in licensing the data to lots of the current compiled file providers in the offline world for postal. In 2014, we made a transition, and this is relatively different from the way most people went on, most organizations went online, but we took an approach, even at that time, recognizing that the cookie was a problematic situation over the long term. So we spent a couple of years building what we call an IP delivery system. That IP delivery system was really designed to focus based on network information on the delivery point to the modems and the homes and the businesses. We got 4 or 5 patents for that process, and then spent a lot of time in that market, particularly where what IP has as an advantage generally is the notion of being able to reach most of the population without having to have a cookie in place. And what that led us to was initially mobile, and then to video, and then to other marketplaces and platforms.
So is that still the foundation of your tech, the IP address?
Actually not. I mean, it is and it isn't. Okay, so what we've done over that period where it was initially just IP to destination point, we've started to build out what we call a constellation identity graph. What that constellation identity does is incorporate, mobile device signals, emails, location, IP, offline data. So all the different touch points to consumers and businesses in the marketplace, where none of the ID points or touch points are any more valued than the other. It's really what the constellation does is figure out what is the most accurate touch point and prioritizes that. From there, and that, if you think of that as sort of the inner ring of the graph, the outer ring is all of the third-party providers, platform providers. So we've got direct integrations with all the major DSPs, several of the SSPs, and also more recently, and this really sort of goes to our regulatory priorities, is to look at actual first-party data providers and incorporate their IDs into the graph as well. So really what kind of differentiates us a little bit is we've got upwards of 48 different IDs in the graph at this point. Different types of IDs, including things like major health insurance providers and credit card providers and others, where you're not transacting on anything other than a permissioned identifier.
Right. So is it a co-op where one healthcare provider joins and suddenly their ID is helpful to everybody else?
No, it is not. It's first-party data. So
first party.
It's all first-party. So, I mean, as you're well aware, what's happened over time is we've kind of gone through what I call the mirror and the window phase of identity. The mirror being everybody freaked out because our cookie's going away. So we try to find something to look just like it. And a lot of it turned into emails or mobile devices strictly. What we've tried to do is take more of a window approach to it and say, look beyond that and say, all right, what's the identifier for the future? What's that going to look like? And I think we're kind of living through the walled garden phase of this, and really now we're moving into the first party phase.
So, okay. So to make sure I understand, so you have a first party data from one of your customers, and then the graph is probabilistic on top of that. So is it how is it deterministic across devices?
It's deterministic again across devices because everything goes back to our origins of the compiled data. So we have in our graph, so if you want to think about it as three parts, we've got all of the offline connection points, and we have about 8,000 variables associated with all of that. And then you got the online connection points, which is a constellation, if you will, of their ID in their offline world, as well as their things like emails and mobile devices and everything. And then finally, the third part of that is the platforms in which they engage.
Okay, so an offline data point might be, household address, other information that's publicly available or available widely, right? And then you're saying, well, okay, this household, I can now link to a mobile device and also to a first-party data source for one of our customers.
One entry into the constellation equals all the others. So everything is really finished off by a location to a postal address and a parcel. Actually, a physical parcel for every household in the United States.
Gotcha. Okay. It's often easier to understand stuff if we talk about the customer. So you mentioned healthcare, financial, et cetera. Can you walk me through like a typical customer use case?
Sure. I'll walk you through a couple. One is in the healthcare world, health insurance, for example. We have customers who looked at digital as a mechanism for saving money, primarily. And with what we had to do in order to be validated in that space is we had to become SOC 2 Type 2 and high trust compliant, which we have accomplished for several years at this point. And what we did is we have access, because we're compliant, we have access to their member file. And what they look at is this notion of how do I communicate all of different products and services that I need to communicate to my members, because by law I'm forced to, as an insurer, to do that once a month or once a quarter. And so what we've done is built a graph that's specific for their ID to their customers, and then we run the full gamut of building out campaigns on a regular basis, step by step, and then validating that it reached them.
And is this primarily a paid advertising model that they're
yes.
Is the use case is paid by advertising?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Are there other use cases? Like, do they use you for social, or do they use you for search or anything else? Or is it just, it's like open web paid?
It's all display. It's all display connected television and video.
Got it. Okay. And so on your website, when you're going through the products, it says, an identity graph, clean room technology, first party data design. It'd be helpful to talk about what those distinctions mean.
Okay. The identity graph we discussed.
We talked about that. Right.
Okay. So a clean room is think of it as the following. One of the methods that we use to identify a first party record or any customer information is that it's the audience designer platform is self-serve. And so they control the files. They always control the data. So what happens is they're able to load the file directly into the platform. And when it goes into memory, it syncs to the graph and the original file is dropped. So what it's doing is mapping to an anonymous ID within the graph, which only they understand and only they can retrieve. So in that sense, what we've tried to do is architect a system that really maintains that clean room basis.
So you're using clean room as, in a sense, to explain the bridging between their first party data, which is obviously highly sensitive, and a common third party data that they could use in a DSP or somewhere else.
Right, exactly. And so if you think of this as taking the next part of this is if you're working in pharma, one of the requirements that is, clear and obvious is that you have to follow HIPAA compliant procedures.
Right.
It's part of SOC 2. We do that. What we've done is built a system that allows that the data that's loaded all be aggregated into HIPAA compliant clusters and regionally and population-wise validated. So each of those methods are producing a segment for third-party outreach that is HIPAA compliant.
So many of the clean rooms focus on publisher use cases. So they'll say like, hey, the pharma company wants to run ads on WebMD, but not cookie-based. So they use identity in a clean room. Do you do that sort of one-to-one mapping?
There's no cookies in our system whatsoever.
Right? Whatever, any identity.
Yeah. So essentially what we're doing, they're using that concept in the sense of saying, look, we've obscured the identity, wink, wink, right? And so what we've done is essentially said, for these highly regulated markets, we want to make sure that that identity is in a compliant form at all times. So, which in HIPAA obviously is clusters to 250 people, households and such.
Right. And so the main output of both the identity graph and the clean room is a set of identities that you can go back to a DSP to activate.
Right. Actually, what we've done is the other half of the clean room part of that is we see everything the DSP sees, and we're transacting on their ID.
Right.
So their ID by definition is anonymous in their world. We see their ID. We're doing that sync on our end. We're pushing back their ID.
Their ID, right? Exactly. Is DSP the main use case, or you also integrate with SSPs?
Yes, both.
Yeah. And are all the customers really buy side, or do you have any sell side customers like WebMD or someone like that?
Increasingly, we're starting to see from the SSP side, we're starting to do more direct SSP buys.
Right. And then
PMPs. Yeah.
What is on your website? It talks a lot about first party data design.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Essentially, what it means is that we have the benefit of knowing the population in terms of the compiled data that we've compiled. We own it. And, for example, things like our income estimate is used widely around the industry in lots of places that you probably you'd recognize immediately. But what we've done is we're able to produce a predictive offline model of the population that we're trying to serve. One of the benefits of our platform is to say that, very often the typical use case in display or DSPs has been load your data and start layering different variables on top of it in order to find your best path to an outcome. What we're doing is the opposite of that. We're coming in and saying, look, take your first party data. If you want to look alike, build it in the offline world with real people and then load that. Right. So essentially taking the inefficiency out of that process.
Well, it seems to me like with your core asset of all these deterministic data, that customers would want to use your data outside of advertising. Like they'd want to pull it back into their analytics and things like that.
In many cases we do. And we have the audience designer, which is primarily designed for advertising and display and video and CTV. And then we've got a version, which is an enterprise plugin that is essentially that Constellation Identify ID solution built into their infrastructure. Right. So we plug that in.
Got it. Cool. Let's talk about sort of privacy and cookies because we've touched on it a couple of times. Let's do cookies first. So you don't have any cookies, right? But ultimately, you're syncing with a DSP's ID, which is somewhat dependent on cookie. Yeah. Either 100% or 50% or some percent.
Yeah, it'd be a little frustrating to try and serve something on a browser without a cookie.
Right.
Yeah, obviously. So you have to sync to a cookie on the browser no matter what, and at least for the time being. And so what we've tried to do is just make that an artifact or a key. The flip side of that argument, quite honestly, is, the cookie was associated with an email for onboarding for years. And now we've just privatized that, in a lot of cases across the industry in identity services. We essentially made it a walled garden ID or made it or something, the first party ID.
So what, I guess the question is like, what IDs do you have? Like if they're not cookies and you're matching to cookies, are they device IDs?
They're all of the above. They're they're basically the IP and the time of the IP time and date in a sync. Then there's the mobile devices, and then there's emails, and then there's physical location that is associated with IP, and then then you have the offline, basically all of the offline information all linked together.
Yeah,
all of that is linked together.
So how do you feel about the future of IP addresses and how viable they're going to be? I mean, we see Apple already trying to reduce their usefulness.
I mean, obviously, Apple's trying to reduce the. Google, frankly, has been doing it for 3 years, so it's not news. It's just what it is. The one caveat to our process that we feel has some defensibility is they don't control the modem, and so the modem is really what is material to us.
Right. So the cable DSP providers are kind of the question mark whether what they'll do.
Well, you can't, I think increasingly we're seeing the IP is not viable as a match key within the DSPs, which is fine. It doesn't, there's some for bad actors, and IP could be a problem for the population. But, the way we look at it, it's just another match key within our graph.
Right. So what's your perspective on privacy and how it relates to your graph?
I think a couple things come into play. I think that privacy, as I mentioned earlier, I think identity and privacy that's associated with it is moving to the first party, which is going to essentially where the identity graph is going to get syndicated across the major brands. I think we're well into that phase, and I think it's just going to accelerate. And there'll be providers that help brands bridge that gap going forward. What you're not going to see is, I believe, a single universal ID or anything like that. I think what's going to happen is it's going to get democratized across the brands, and everybody's going to have their own identity space, and they'll control it. And I think that's the proper response to this problem at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's through the experience of GDPR and just understanding the way that legislation rolled out. The problem is for the graph providers, because so if you think about it, your 100%. Customers are controllers of their data and the publishers are controllers of their data. But if you maintain your own graph, you effectively need to be a controller of that graph, and it's pretty hard to get consent to do that.
Right. And I 100% agree, which is why the first party has to control it.
Mm-hmm. How does the economics work for your product? How is it paid for?
Audience Designer is based on a CPM basis, and it's based on usage. So we have these syncs with the DSPs, and we onboard the files. And typically one of the benefits that they get out of that, they see it's full transparency as to what matched and what didn't. And when they upload it, they pay on what they use, not on what they uploaded.
So it's a CPM fee,
yes,
based on usage, not on graph size, but on media purchased.
Yes.
Do you charge direct, or does it get bundled in with the DSP fee?
Often it's bundled in with the DSP.
And
certain platforms like Facebook and Roku, for example, they don't have the ability to clear. So
right. So on Roku, Facebook, the advertiser has a IO with you or a MSA with you that has a fee, X cents per CPM.
Yeah.
And then if they buy in, let's say the Trade Desk, it might be bundled in, and they just get a $5 CPM. Of which some portion is your fee.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Cool. Makes sense. And do you have anything to say about, or anything you'd like to share about your roadmap?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're doing is we're consistently looking at ways to accelerate and broaden the graph. One of the things we're adding shortly will be a contextual component to the graph, which essentially says, take your first party data, load it into Audience Designer, and get back keywords and get URLs of endemic sites for that audience. And also the reverse is true. Take the keywords and get back audiences. So take sites and get audiences. So
where do you get that data from?
We work with a partner to get the actual component matching of the contextual. We've been working for years. And so it's the idea, we're essentially tying the contextual to the household into the business.
I meant to ask you, I forgot to ask you about how your solution fits in with other solutions these advertisers might use. Is it typical that they would use you for onboarding, but would have a different vendor as a DMP or a CMP?
I think what you'll see now, because I think one of the things that you'll find in Audience Designer is that it's got an onboarding component to it, and then it's got an audience design component to it, where you can maximize or optimize your audience before, for example, if I have a political voters in who's voting today, Oklahoma, and in Oklahoma, go to the polls and say who's a frequent voter in Oklahoma. We'll have the data there that they can filter and create And so do DMP-like things are in the first-party context, CDP type things, and they can load and get the optimized file before they onboard it. Right. Then at that point, we can allow them to do the attribution from the first, to say, did I serve that person or did I not serve it? So the full continuity of Audience Designer is provided there. So I like to think of it as, yes, we do onboarding, but we also do audience design and attribution, and it's all in the hands of the advertiser. So they're getting what they want. So I like to think of it as almost some mashup of CDP, DMP, and onboarding.
Got it. Okay. So let's do a lightning round. So we're going to ask you, a bunch of quick questions, looking for relatively quick answers.
Okay.
What's your one competitive advantage versus other solutions?
I think the main thing is time to market and match rates. Those two things are the main things. We average time to market in an hour.
Well, why is time to market faster?
Because we actually see the IDs and they don't have to sync on the other end. So essentially, if I have a Xandr ID, I've pre-matched it and sent Xandr the ID they need to serve, so it's ready. And so like in Xandr, it might be half an hour to 3/4 of an hour. Facebook, it's almost instantaneous. Mobi, it's very quick. Trade Desk, it's the next day, and so on and so forth.
Interesting. Okay.
Match rates average about 85%.
All right. So I asked this of all companies. Why won't the walled gardens like Google and Facebook crush you?
I like to think of it as because of the issue of transparency. I think transparency is a big deal with marketers, and I think they want more control, not less. I think as an industry, we need to arm them, the brands, to be able to control their data. And I think they've already made the brands are really calling the shots, not the walled gardens. And I think the brands will really eventually take back control.
Got it. What's your biggest challenge in the market?
I think the biggest thing that we face is obviously sales. As everybody does. We've been around since 2009 and we're bootstrapped and we've been profitable for all these years. But I think one of the things about scale that's important is to make sure that you get the distribution in place. And I think we finally got that. Now we're just executing.
Got it. Last question. If your company was an animal, what animal would it be?
Good question. I'll tip my hat to my dog. I'll say it'd be a Jack Russell.
What's that?
Yeah, my dog Daggett would love that. He's feisty and he gets what he wants. So he's always pushing.
All right, that's a good answer. Well, that is great. So, Ray, thank you so much for joining. For full Marketecture subscribers, we're also going to have a demo of the platform. So stay tuned to watch that. Once again, Ray, thanks for being here.
Anytime. Thanks, Ari.
Thank you for subscribing to Marketecture. New interviews are added every week at marketecture.tv and your favorite podcasting app.